From beautiful East Tennessee in the foothills of the Smoky Mountains, you are listening to the Sherry Voluntary Show, and I do appreciate you spending your time with me. Today, my guest is someone I met who was doing a fantastic presentation called Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Raw Milk. He's a farmer and owner of the Fall Creek Farms here in Tennessee, a homesteader, and recently started the Sequatchie School for Self Reliance, which I'd love to talk about that a little bit too. So, Brad Bleasdale, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Great, thank you. So now you are a farmer here in Tennessee, but you're not originally from Tennessee, and you weren't originally a farmer, correct?
Well, I grew up on a small farm in Massachusetts. I was one of 13 kids, so we kind of had to farm if we're going to eat. And then graduated from college and swore I'd never farm again. Went to law school for a good long time, but didn't quite graduate. Had to decide whether to stay with my wife or stay in law school. Made one of the very few good decisions I've ever made and stayed with my wife. And got in the financial services business and entered the rat race. And when I turned 40, right on schedule, I had my midlife crisis and decided to become a homesteader up in Tennessee.
Well, quite a difference from being a lawyer down in Florida.
Yeah, no, I was never a lawyer. I didn't quite graduate. I was about, I was like 6 weeks shy of graduation and pulled the plug. Mm-hmm. The world's a better place for it.
Right. I guess the last thing we need is more lawyers. So just as an aside note, what is the state of farming in the United States today? I had read something a couple of years ago that farms were on the decline. Is that still the case?
Well, it's pretty much the case. I mean, farming is no longer even listed as an occupation on the census. There's fewer than 1 million full-time farmers left in the country. Tennessee is down to fewer than 200 dairy farmers full-time. Wow. So it's a pretty sad state of affairs, farming. But there's also a big upswell of youngsters wanting to get into farming, which I think is good. I normally tell them they need to hold their breath till the feeling goes away when they tell me they want to farm. But it's actually very encouraging.
Yeah, I have noticed in the past, say, 10 years, it seems like a lot of people are going to these small, like, hobby farms on their own property. And I have a lot of friends. I homeschool, and it seems like a lot of homeschoolers are really into raising chickens and goats, things like that. We've thought of starting an apiary and getting a goat for the poison ivy on my property, but it's kind of a different story. But I've sort of noticed this trend of people going to these small farms, but they're more just for themselves and what they can grow for themselves. But it's a great skill to have, and if you ever need that to know how to grow things, it's certainly important. Why do you think that? Is it just the hard work that has made farming kind of die out, or is it the big factory farms are kind of killing the small traditional farms?
Yeah, it's a combination of a whole lot of things. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie, the documentary film Food, Inc., but it talks about how back in the 70s, the USDA intentionally set about with its farm policy and subsidies. The way they said it was either get big or get out. So they would subsidize folks to get really, really big in farming. And they said, our intention is to make sure that the United States has the cheapest food of any industrial country. And they've succeeded. I mean, our food cost per capita is very, very low. It's not very good food, but it's certainly inexpensive. So it's impossible for a small farmer. I remember when I was a kid, my dad said, you can never compete with commodities, because if you've got a farmer farming 400 or 4,000 acres of something, there's no way somebody farming 4 or 5 acres can compete with them on that basis. So it's very, very difficult. And really, to be a successful small farmer, you have to be a lot better at sales than you are at farming if you want to succeed.
Yeah, that's kind of tough. Usually those aren't things that necessarily go together. If you're a good farmer, you may not be a good salesman.
That's for sure.
So I really loved your presentation that you gave. And, of course, you were talking about raw milk, which is illegal to sell in the state of Tennessee, in this, land of the free that we are in.
I could be a milk terrorist, beard and raw milk.
Right.
It's all over.
And it's 18 states that milk is illegal, or raw milk is illegal to sell to humans for human consumption, correct?
I think that's about right. Yeah, it's going down all the time. The number of states allowing us to actually live like free people is going up. But Tennessee was about to reverse that trend, and we successfully fought them off. But yeah, I mean, it's just insane to me that in a free country, free people can't buy and sell something like milk.
Right. I remember years ago, I used to live in Wisconsin, and there was a dairy farm like right behind where we lived, and they wouldn't sell me raw milk. Like I went over there and I was like, hey, can I just buy some milk right from the counter? They're like, no, 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 we can't do that. We could lose our farm. And I was just really surprised and shocked at that, because I thought, well, I'm a grown up. I can take the risk, and in Colorado, it was the same thing. I tried to find at the time, this is say 16 years ago, tried to find a raw milk, someone who would sell it to me, and they wouldn't, because the risk is just too high. So it's not because they actually believe that raw milk is dangerous. It's that they don't want to get in trouble with the government.
For sure, yeah. The risk isn't from the milk. The risk is from people. We've had folks try to entrap us on more than one occasion. And it's always risky because, people will come to the farmer's market and say, well, I just want it for my pets, or I'm, here just for a few weeks and I don't want to buy the herd share. So can you help me out? And, it would put our livelihood at risk. It's just outrageous, but it's the way it is.
Right. And so explain the herd share program, because that's what a lot of dairy farmers, I guess, in Tennessee have done to kind of nullify the law that's on the books that's ridiculous. So what is that exactly?
Yeah, well, it doesn't actually nullify the law, Sherry. Actually, we're in complete compliance with the law. About 10 years or so ago, Senator Nicely from out in your neck of the woods managed to get through the state legislature a bill to, because he knew that he would never convince the health department and the Department of Agriculture in the state to legalize the sale of milk. So what they did is they passed what's called a herd share law. And what that says is if you buy part of our herd, it's kind of like a mutual fund for cows or goats. Now you own part of the herd. So when you pay us a weekly fee, you're not buying milk, you're paying us to milk the critters and keep them happy and all that good stuff. So when I bring you your milk, I'm not selling it to you. I'm delivering you your portion of the herd's milk, which is good because now you can get wonderful, yummy, healthy milk, and I can make a living and not go to jail. And I have a things to do list at home, and number one on it every day is don't go to jail today.
Right. Which is becoming easier and easier to do in this land of the free. There was a book out, I can't remember the name of it, but it talked about how the average person breaks 5 federal laws a day, something like
5 felonies a day. Yeah, everybody needs to get that one. Yeah, it's crazy, but it is what it is.
Yeah, we have to, I guess, do the workarounds. So just how safe is raw milk? Because I went to the Capitol a couple months ago now, and I actually talked to Senator Briggs, who is trying to put through the bill that would make it. He's called it just a reporting bill, but I think you had a different perspective on this when we talked at your presentation before. So it seems like it's a little more invasive than just how he would put it as a reporting bill.
Yeah, well, it started out, as far as your question goes, the first part, how safe is raw milk? The answer to that is there is no food on the planet that's perfectly safe. People get sick all the time. Sometimes that sickness is caused by food. Mm-hmm. As far as foodborne illness goes, part of my presentation was demonstrating using the numbers from the state and the federal government that not only is raw milk healthy, but it's among the safest of foods that we can eat, using their own numbers. And yet, if you go to the CDC or the state health department, they say explicitly, not only is raw milk unsafe, it's one of the least safe foods you can eat, which is absolute baloney. So there's no question that as food goes, raw milk is very, very safe, certainly safer than things like leafy greens or sushi, stuff like that. Right. The second part of your question regarding Senator Briggs, when he first introduced this bill, it was explicitly to eliminate the herd share law and just make it illegal. So even, for example, my Mennonite friends would not be able to get milk from their next door neighbor. The way his law was written was unless you own the complete cow or goat, you may not drink the milk from it under penalty of law. So then after that got shot down, then they said, well, as long as you go to some training or whatever that we do, then you can, then you'll be allowed to somehow distribute your milk. Thankfully, our friends in the legislature and a huge groundswell of freedom-loving people got it so that the whole thing went away. But he's a pretty adamant kind of guy. He's pretty relentless, and I'm pretty sure we'll see those efforts again.
Yeah, and when I spoke to him about it, he got pretty got a little bit heated at first because I challenged his principles. Because I talked to him about, self-ownership and self-determination, and does he believe in those things? And he said yes, but then when it comes to this issue, he doesn't believe that. He doesn't believe that people should be allowed to take risk. And I think we've become this society that's so risk averse that we are willing to, many people anyways, are willing to give up freedom for safety. And I don't know, in a country full of adults, I figure you can take that risk. And if you get sick from something, that's kind of, you knew the risks. But like you said, there's not really this kind of risk that they would like you to believe that there is with the raw milk.
Yeah, well, I've never met Senator Briggs, so I don't know him personally. To me, he's a typical Republican politician who, the way our political. Yeah, I was listening to a Jordan Peterson podcast a few weeks ago, and he made a great point. He said, "Why is everything political?" And when you think about it, why is raw milk a political issue? Mm-hmm. Why are all of these things political? And I remember when I was a kid, my dad and I were driving, and we listened to WBZ in Boston, and the newscaster said, "Lawmakers met in Boston today," and my dad leaned forward and turned off the radio. And I said, "What's up, Dad?" And he said, "Well, they used to call them representatives. Now they call them lawmakers. When they were representatives, they represented the people. Mm-hmm. Now that they call them lawmakers, they think they have to make laws." And, Jefferson said those are governed best who are governed least. And right. I'm kind of old-fashioned that way. I tend to agree with Mr. Jefferson.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's part of a mindset that they have. And it's the same with police. Now they're law enforcers. They're not peace officers anymore, which is very unfortunate. Because I think that that sort of hammer and nail mindset has become very prevalent, and it's not good. It's not good for freedom, that's for sure, and for free people. So this battle, I guess, or war on raw milk, if you want to call it that, has been going on for quite some time in this country. And so why is that? Why is there this? Why does the FDA and other regulatory bodies, why are they so concerned about this when their own numbers show different?
Well, Sherry, I am not a conspiracy theorist. I am a conspiracy analyst. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. So as to their motivation, I can't speak to that. My general theory with those things is, a lot of people will say follow the money. And I think that's to some extent the case, but I really think that a big part of it, people who are regulators feel like they need to regulate. People who are lawmakers feel like they need to make laws. And generally speaking, their first impulse is not, what can we do to increase the liberty of our people? What can we do to protect their inherent God-given rights? Their general thought is, how can we protect these people? I hear politicians, local, state, federal, the president say, my first duty is to protect the people. And that's contrary to the very essence of what it means to be an American. If you read the Declaration of Independence, what did Jefferson say? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that we're created equal, that we're all endowed with certain unalienable rights. And what does he say right after that? Governments are instituted among men to preserve and protect those rights. Right. Governments aren't there to keep us safe. They're there to keep us free, and they are not doing a very good job, in my opinion.
Right. Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. Yeah, safety is not, that's my responsibility to keep myself safe. And I think it goes back to that sort of risk-averse culture that we've become so, we're so comfortable in this day and time. And I remember talking with someone years ago about we were at this exhibit where they had pictures of people from 150 years ago out in Colorado, and so many of their children died. They had this whole collection of just they used to take pictures of dead people. It was a very popular thing to do, and so many children died, and just people died of in their the prime of their life. And I think that in a way, we've gotten so far removed from that because we have, technology and medicine has gotten very good and we don't die as much. And so now people are so afraid of dying and so afraid of just the normal risks of life, not anything like, jumping off a cliff or anything. It's just the regular, like drinking raw milk or whatever else. They're so afraid to take those risks that they're giving up their freedom wholesale and just saying, keep us safe. That's what we're interested in. And yet in the other breath, they'll say, we love our freedoms. We want liberty. And
yeah. And it's not just freedom. It's things even more, even more mundane than that. Like in many, many states, until a kid is 18, they can't use a knife in a restaurant. And I'm like, what are you kidding me? And, that's part of the reason I started the school, the Sequatchie School for Self Reliance, because people have no self-reliance skills at all. And it's so, do you know the difference when you're weeding between a plant and a weed? If you go out in the woods, can you actually do something as simple as look up at the sky and figure out which way is east and west? And it's just remarkable how it's not only that they don't have those skills, so many people don't care to have those skills. Mm-hmm. And it's not a positive trend, in my opinion. And so that's why we do what we do, to try to live closer to the land, try to live more off the land, and certainly not anything like true homesteading. And we try to teach people through our various outlets what it means to get your hands dirty and get bloodied up a little bit. It's not going to kill you. I remember when I was a kid, I was kind of a loser. And my dad had asked me to do something, and I loved reading books about the outdoors and pioneers and all this. I was very into reading about all this stuff, Mm-hmm. And my dad asked me to do something. I don't know what it was, split some wood for the fire or something. So he gets home, and he said, "Did you do what I asked you to do?" And I said, "No." And he said, you read all these books about pioneering and all this stuff. He said, 100 years ago, kids your age were out winning the West, killing Indians, and taking care of families, and I can't even get you to split some wood. And, nowadays, I'm sure they'd call child services on a dad that did that, but it was a wake-up call for me, and I was like, wow, he's right. I'm slacking. And that made a tremendous change in my behavior. I still remember, I'm 57 years old, and I still remember it to this day.
Yeah. I think that's so important to, talk about, because I personally believe in radical freedom, but I also do believe in radical personal responsibility. And that's something that, I'm working on in terms of my philosophy and where I've come to politically. I'm now trying to do that other component of being more self-reliant. And it takes time. It takes time to get those skills back. And I think about, my great-grandparents who I think one of my great-grandmothers started working in a factory when she was 5. My other great-grandparents, they worked when they were little kids as well. So, and they were farmers. And a lot of what they've learned or what they knew has been lost to my generation for sure. And my great-grandmother was Creek, and she knew a lot about natural medicine, and I know nothing basically, compared to what she did. And so I think those skills are really important because, hopefully we'll never have to live a subsistence type of life, but there is something to be said for being self-reliant and knowing that you can take care of yourself. And I think a lot of kids are really missing that. And you hear people talk about self-esteem a lot with kids. Oh, they need their self-esteem. But the way to build self-esteem in kids is to let them be responsible and let them have jobs and let them do things that actually they can say, I did that. And that's my work and I'm proud of it. And I just don't see a lot of that today. Do you find a lot of young people coming to your school and trying to get some of these skills back?
If their parents bring them, for sure. Yeah, a lot of folks. Here's the thing. I mean, America's got over 300 million people, so you're always going to be able to find a subset of folks that are interested in those things. But I read a thing the other day. It said the average guy in a maximum security prison spends more time outside than an average teenager. So I'm like, wow, that's not necessarily a good thing. So I think the trend is not positive, but there's also, I find, a great awakening, if you will, of folks interested in what you're talking about, interested in radical freedom, because it's in our DNA. I mean, we can't help it as free people having that tremendous history, never perfect, never certainly perfectly realized, but it's in there. It's in our blood that we want to be free. And no matter how bad whatever forces try to squash that out of it, I don't think they can succeed. And right now, I absolutely feel a great rise of a desire for free people to be free. And it's very encouraging.
Yeah. What I really appreciated about your presentation before too is that you really tied this raw milk issue, which is kind of a microcosm of the bigger issues of freedom that we have in the country, to that. You tied it to that bigger issue, and I thought that you did a really good job of that. Can you go into a little bit of how that's connected and why?
Sure.
That is?
Yeah. Because I started looking around at the thing that's right now the big deal is interstate transport of unpasteurized milk is illegal if you're going to sell it. So that comes under not a law, but a federal regulation from the federal, I think it's the Department of Agriculture, which carries the weight of law. If you do it, you're still in big trouble, right? So I started researching, well, where does all these regulations come from? And it turns out that the Code of Federal Regulation is where all these federal regulations, not laws passed by the legislature, but rules passed by the various federal departments. And, when people often tell me, well, I think we need some regulation. Well, it turns out that just on a federal level, we've got over 180,000 pages of federal regulations. So when they tell me, I think I need some regulation, I'm like, well, we've got 180,000 pages. How many more would you like before you're satisfied that your life is being sufficiently regulated? Or another thing that I like to say is, well, what part of your life would you like me to run for you? And they said, what are you talking about? Well, you want more regulation. I'm here to regulate you. Just tell me what part of your life, because it's people that implement these things. So, when I started looking at it, I'm like, well, here's this regulation that says it's illegal to transport unpasteurized milk across state lines for commercial purposes. And then I just said, well, where's that come from? The CFR. And I started looking at it. I'm like, holy moly. I mean, the federal government regulates the size of the holes in Swiss cheese. I mean, I think between me and you, Sherry, we can handle whether or not the holes in that cheese are big enough without involving some bureaucrat from Washington. I'm funny that way. Call me a radical. But, I think we can handle a lot of that stuff on ourselves. And then especially when people tell me, well, I'm a constitutionalist. And I'm like, really? Well, let me show you the 10th Amendment. Any of these powers not absolutely given to the federal government are reserved to the states or the people. So just show me where the Constitution. I'll tell you a funny story. Down in Florida, my wife and I went to some shindig or other. I think it was the Orlando Chamber of Commerce or something like that. So anyways, my congressman representative is there. So I go chat with the guy and I tell him where I live. And he says, hey, we just appropriated, I forget how many millions of dollars for waterfront protection in that whole area where you live. And I'm not exaggerating. My wife literally grabs me by the collar and drags me away. And I said, why'd you do that? She said, because the next words out of your mouth were going to be, so tell me, Congressman, where would you look in the Constitution to authorize several $1 million for that? I'm like, well, how'd you know I was going to say that? And that's because that's what I was going to say.
I'm sure she knows you.
So, yeah, absolutely. So, I'm not, people will say, well, you're anti-government. I'm not the least anti-government. Unlike my friend Sherry, I'm not an anarchist, okay? I kind of like having the government do what it's supposed to do And other than that, leave me alone.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, they don't do what they're supposed to do, which is to protect our liberty, stuff like that. And instead, they do all these things they're not authorized to do. And I just kind of want them to turn that ship of state around and go back to where we came from. I'd be very happy if we could do that.
Yeah. I'm reminded of a couple of things. One is just a couple of years ago where there's the cheese industry, these cheese that's aged on wood boards. And there was some pencil-headed FDA guy that came and decided just this practice that has been going on for at least
so dangerous.
Right. And
we need plastic.
Yes, hundreds of years. He almost ruined an industry. And that to me is very dangerous when one pencil-necked guy can come in and ruin a whole industry of for people. These are their livelihoods. They've been doing it for the longest time, and yet, they can do that. And also, one of the first shows I did with my friend Dan Reed, The Culinary Libertarian is his podcast. We talked about a book that was on food rights, they called it. Not really rights, but that aside, there was a story in there about some people who were buying produce from certain farms, and it had to be brought in on a truck. And I may be getting this a little bit wrong, but they thought there was raw milk on the truck. So the government, whatever agency it was, stopped it, and they basically ruined all the food. They just threw it out, or it went bad. I can't remember, but just those kinds of things where if you're not to the letter of the law, it doesn't matter. Like, all logic has gone out the window, and all just real, horse sense, as my grandparents used to say, has just kind of gone aside for this kind of compliance mentality that so many people, the bureaucrats, have. Have you experienced anything like that with in person in your industry?
Well, yes, but not necessarily anything I'd care to relate. But the examples are just multitude. Those poor kids down in Georgia trying to raise some money, so they got a lemonade stand, and the health department comes and shuts them down. I think it was Chicago last Thanksgiving, and the health department, these folks are out there from a church feeding homeless people, and they didn't have a permit, and the health department came and actually poured bleach on perfectly good food to make sure they didn't feed it to the homeless people.
Right.
I mean, it's just so outrageous, and the examples of that just gets more and more outrageous, and we put up with it because that's what we do.
Yeah, it's hard to know what to do about it, because I don't think anyone wants to resort to violence. I know I don't, and I don't want other people to do that either. But it's almost the monstrosity of it is so big. It's kind of hard to know where to start, and I guess we just chip away at it as we can. One of the things that you had talked about too, and I thought this quote was just amazing, and I don't remember. I'm sure you'll remember it. It was the one about raw milk or milk that one of the old time guys had said. I can't. It's about that in the future they won't be able to sell.
Oh well, yeah, that was me being a little sarcastic. I was quoting at the Battle of Lexington and Concord, April 19th, 1775. The shot heard round the world, and the captain of the colonial militia had said, men, we don't want a war, but if they'll have a war, let it start here. And then, tongue-in-cheek, I said, and he followed that up with his rousing way of motivating his men, and he said, if we're successful defeating these tyrants, well, then in 240 years, our grandkids will go to jail for selling raw milk. And somehow I didn't think that was had quite the motivating effect he hoped for. But that's just they were fighting off what they considered a tyrannical government, which when we look at what we live with today, we'd look at them and say, man, you guys had it pretty darn good under the crown. What were you griping about? And yet they were willing to shed blood for it.
Right.
And, I want things to get better. And that's where educating the public the way we're doing will get the job done is my great hope.
Mine too. You also brought up something in your presentation that really touched me and that I hadn't heard before. and I've shared it a couple of times now, but it was about the winter soldiers at Valley Forge. And can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, after the revolution started and winter came, General Washington had to, back then they couldn't really fight through the wintertime. They didn't have the facilities to do so. So what was then just the ragtag start of the Continental Army holed up in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, in what turned out to be one of the coldest winters ever. They didn't have food. They didn't have clothing. They didn't have boots. They didn't have anything. And hundreds of men died over that winter trying to keep together a force that they could go out and fight the British with the following spring. And the folks from overseas, like Lafayette, however you pronounce it in Tennessee, I guess in Tennessee it's Lafayette.
Right.
And when they saw the men gathering in the spring, he said, "I don't need these sunshine soldiers. That they show up now that they've planted their crops and it's pretty weather." He said, "I need those winter soldiers if we're going to win." And it's men. It's like you talked about. Kids don't do anything hard. Well, can we imagine the privation that these guys went through for an ideal? They didn't owe us anything, and they gave us everything. They walked. You could follow where they marched, drilling that winter because of the blood and the snow, because they didn't have boots, for crying out loud. And these guys sacrificed everything so that we could be free. And nowadays people just throw it away. When I look at, people say, "Oh, you better be quiet or you're going to make people," and I'm like, here I am living a very comfortable life in Tennessee. And when you look at the sacrifice these guys made, and so I get up in front of a few people and talk, and they're like, "Oh, give me a break. I'm not getting shot at. I'm not getting frostbite and having my legs amputated with an old rusty saw." It's just people, and because kids don't even know about that. I talked to a young lady at Farmers Market a couple weeks ago, and I was talking about that subject. And I mentioned something about George Washington. And, Washington had many faults. He wasn't necessarily the ideal guy, but he's a great man, absolutely great man. And she said, she was surprised at what I was telling about her. He had his horse shot out from him so many times. He led as a general, the general of the Continental Army. He led every single battle that he fought in from the front. He was there getting shot at. And she said, "The only thing I've ever been taught my whole life about George Washington is that he owned slaves. I didn't know any of that stuff." And I said, "Well, that's true that he did, and it's a bad thing. But if that's all you know about that guy, you can't possibly appreciate what him and the rest of them risked and sacrificed so we could have what we have."
Right. Yeah, I've heard that so many times when you say something about Jefferson or anyone like that. They'll say, "Well, he owned slaves, so you can't." It's almost like they want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like, yes, slavery, chattel slavery especially, was terrible and it was inhumane. That said, not everything these guys did and said was wrong, and there's a lot of great stuff. And if we let the terrible things that occurred in their lifetime rob us of the richness that they understood about freedom and liberty, then I think that's part of why, we have this education, in harsh quotes, education system that, I call it, just like a state indoctrination camp, in my opinion. I don't send my children there. And the reason is because I want them to get a real education. I want them to experience the world and learn real things, not it filtered through what the state wants them to know.
Yeah.
And,
well, I never thought I'd be quoting Joe Biden, but I heard his little ad for when he first announced for the presidency last week. He was talking about Jefferson, and he said, we've never lived up to those ideals that are enunciated in the Declaration, but we've never turned our back on them either. And that's pretty darn good for Uncle Joe.
Yeah, that's interesting. I with the school system, I just don't believe they're ever going to teach they never would teach children what they need to overthrow them or to take their freedoms back. That's not going to happen. So I think that's something that for everyone to consider that that situation in the public schools is pretty dire. But also something that you and I think agree on too is that we can't vote ourselves out of this. And my friend, Michael Malice, who is an anarcho-capitalist such as myself, he says, you can't spend yourself wealthy, as the United States is trying to do, and you can't vote yourself free. And there's no voting our way out of this. It's really going to take education, I think, of a cultural change.
Well, I vacillate between, being that cynical. So that, part of the answer is, well, we voted ourselves into it. But it's like I saw a T-shirt the other day, and it showed a young lady with an AK-47, and it said, the problem with socialism is you can vote your way in, but you have to shoot your way out. And ain't that the truth?
Yeah.
So, I'm feeling particularly cynical today, so I'll tend to agree with the Tinvawoot. But it's we're in very deep weeds. There's no doubt about that. And what we need to do, I think, is figure out what it's going to look like on the other side, because we're going to get to the other side one way or the other.
Mm-hmm.
And but I'll leave that to minds better than mine and folks like you, younger than me.
No, I'm not that much younger. I know. I do feel really good when I see there's a lot of podcasts such as mine by younger people who are really concerned about these things. And I know that, millennials sort of have a bad rap with people and, that whatever that is. But I really do see a lot of young people who are looking for new solutions. And I don't know that they're necessarily finding the right ones, but I feel like a lot of them are open to listen to something and say, hey, we've tried this and it hasn't worked. Let's try something else. And so that gives me a lot of hope for the future. And just knowing as well that, I'm raising my kids a certain way. And I think there's a lot of people out there who are still raising their children to value their freedom over their safety and to be self-reliant. And, my son, he wants to be a mycologist. So he grows mushrooms. He's also interested in aquariums, and he grows plants in his room. He has all these things, all these interests. And I think, children naturally are curious and they know what they like. And if we just kind of encourage those things, then I think we'll have a much sturdier and hardier generation come along. And I'm wondering if a lot of millennials won't kind of turn back to a more traditional way of parenting, just because, they've been kind of helicoptered, a lot of them. And there's been, like everybody gets a trophy type mentality. And I'm hoping that a lot of them have seen, because I know with my parents, I've tried to do better and they try to do better than their parents. And so I'm hoping that that's the case and that they will start to value, the things like hard work and just their children being able to do things and experience life in a real way in the real world.
Sure. That's why a big reason why I started the school. I do a lot of free classes. Next week I'm doing a completely free shooting class. I'm doing another one in June. And, the school provides everything. We provide the guns, the ammo, the targets, so that the only thing people need to show up with is a positive attitude. And I've had folks from everywhere, from, folks out in the hills to deep in the city, come up, bring their kids and find out, because, that's a great example of what's being taught to them from everywhere else. And then when they say, hey, this thing doesn't bite and it's kind of fun. And I really don't think Brad needs to go to prison just because his magazine holds 11 rounds. Yeah, this is okay.
Right.
And it's a great thing, get them out there doing wilderness survival classes, trauma medicine, teaching them how to farm and garden, those kind of things. It's making a very positive difference. And we have to do it. There's no top-down solution. It's going to be a complete bottom-up.
Exactly.
And that suits me just fine. Yes,
that's the whole philosophy of, I know people kind of misunderstand at least market anarchism, which is anarcho-capitalism. It's all about the bottom-up solution and about the subsidiarity, small cities, small counties governing themselves and having governance rather than government. And so it's nuanced, but that's for another show. But yes, it's definitely a bottom up, and it starts with the individual. And I think that's why it's so important. What you're doing, and hopefully what I'm doing, is to, educate people to what can be and how you can take back power. We can have it. We have to first assume it in our own lives, and we have to stop relying on the government to do this or that, and there ought to be a law because we don't like whatever. Just speaking with someone recently about how people have become so reliant on the proxy force of the government that they won't even go talk to their neighbors if their neighbors are doing something that they don't like. They'll call the city on them. They'll call the police on them instead of just going over and saying, hey, can you mow your grass, or can you get the old car out of the, yard,
Sure.
whatever it is.
I had a lady down in Chattanooga wanted me to sign a petition to pass a law to ban mountaintop removal. Well, I didn't know what mountaintop removal was, but she said, it's when they clear cut the trees, and then if they want to, they take minerals out. So I'm like, well, it's their property. So I said, well, have you tried any nonviolent solutions? And she's like, well, what do you mean? I said, well, what you're talking about is a violent solution.
Yes.
She said, no, it's not violent. We're going to pass a law. I said, right. So let's suppose it's my property. I own 1,000 acres, say, and I want to clear cut it, and you don't want me to. So you're going to pass a law. Who's going to enforce that law? She goes, well, the police. I go, right. What do the police have? She's like, what do you mean? I go, the police have guns. They're going to come to my farm with their guns and make sure I don't cut my own trees. I said, have you tried any nonviolent solutions? She said, well, like what? I said, well, have you gone and talked to the guy? I said, hey, we'd kind of like it if you don't cut your trees. She said, no. I said, did you think about buying his property, getting together with your friends? He needs the money. That's why he's cutting the trees. Trees don't make him a lot of money. You guys could probably, I said, up where I live, you can buy 1,000-acre tracts of land all the time for $2,000 an acre. That's only $2 million. You can probably get together 10 or 15 rich people and buy the place for crying out loud. That's like a non-violent. It's like, whoa, I never thought of that. And I'm like, well, it beats sending the police to tell the guy he can't cut his trees if he wants to.
Right.
And that's what I'm hoping we can get to, is where people will think of bottom-up, non-violent solutions where instead of I remember when I lived in Florida, this lady was having trouble disciplining her kids, and she called the police. And I was like, oh my goodness.
Becoming more common.
I didn't know what to do about that. So I just kind of let that one go. So that's our hope, is free people can live together in a free country and settle our disputes in a nonviolent way and, kind of be free. Kind of a radical thought.
Radical freedom, radical personal responsibility. Well, Brad, it's been great having you on the show, and we're at the end here. Can you give us any websites that you have and share just whatever you've got going on? I know your son and daughter-in-law do the creamery side of it as well, so pitch your stuff.
They own Orchard House Creamery. They do the cow side of things. My wife and I own Fall Creek Farms, and we do the goat side of things. So it's fallcreekfarms.net. The creamery is orchardhousecreamery.com, and they do grass-fed beef and all that good stuff. We'd love to get 20 or 30 folks out in Knoxville that want to get milk to make it financially viable to come out there.
Great.
And then the school is sequatchieschool.com. Yeah, just like the county down by me, that's where we started it. And I think that's it.
Okay. So anyone here in the Knoxville area that might want to participate in the herd share program, they just go through your website to do that?
Yeah, if we could get enough, because it's a good long haul from here to Knoxville. Yeah. So if we could get 25 or 30 folks that would become herd share members, so we were delivering 30 gallons or so a week, it would be worth our time to do so, and we'd love to do that.
Great. Well, that's wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Brad, for coming on. I really appreciate it, and keep doing the great work that you're doing. Your presentation is fantastic, and I would encourage anyone who is able to go and see that to definitely do that, because I think it's got a lot of valuable information in it and really exposes the bigger picture of freedom in the country, in the state of freedom. So,
well, I'm working on a new one now that'll really light people up. It's called Vaccines, Fact, and Fiction. and I have to have that done by July 11th because I'm booked to give that down in Chattanooga. So we'll see what happens.
Poor Senator Briggs. You're going to have him running all over the place because
I
he's for
think he's a good.
mandatory vaccinations.
I think he's a good guy at heart.
I don't, but okay. He's probably a good guy. I don't think he understands freedom. Let's put it that way. Like so many politicians, that's not uncommon though. But thanks, guys. And until next week, peace.